This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Good morning, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. It's our first program of The Bridge in 2022. So I hope it's going to be a happy, prosperous, and most importantly, a healthy year for all of us everywhere. Inshallah, that's our hope and prayer. And today we're discussing a very important and timely topic: press freedom in the Arab world in 2021, changes and challenges. And with me this morning discussing this important topic are two experts in this area of press freedom in the Arab world. My first guest is Mr. Justin Shilad, who is the senior researcher in Middle East and North Africa section of Committee to Protect Journalists since 2019. And before that, he was research associate also at Committee to Protect Journalists since 2017. Before that, he worked as an editor and freelance reporter in different places, including Egypt Independent in Cairo. And he also assisted in the resettlement of refugees in Egypt and Kenya. And my second guest is Mr. Ismail Kushkush. He's a Sudanese American independent journalist who contributed to many prestigious international media outlets, and he was an acting bureau chief of the New York Times bureau in East Africa in Nairobi, Kenya in 2014 and 2015. Welcome to the show, Ismail and Justin.
Thank you for having us.
Morning, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us, joining our listeners and viewers on US Arab Radio and on Facebook in many different places. I want to start with you, Justin. Before we zoom in on the Arab world and talk about the condition of press freedom in the Arab world in 2021, can you briefly give us an idea about the status of journalism and press freedom around the world in 2021? What did the picture look like?
Sure. So in 2021, in terms of press freedom globally, we saw pretty unprecedented challenges, mainly with regards to journalists in prison around the world. According to CPJ's research, which we compile every year to give a snapshot of journalists in prison worldwide, 2021 saw the highest number of journalists imprisoned on record since we started keeping those records. We at CPJ, according to our data, on December 1st, 2021, there were 293 journalists imprisoned worldwide. It's a pretty staggering number, and it shows that there has been overall an increase in hostility and repercussions for journalists doing their work worldwide. There has been a clampdown on press freedom, on the space for journalists to operate in, and that is reflected in the number of journalists behind bars, unfortunately. Additionally, we also saw at least 27 journalists killed in relation to their work in 2021. That's just to give some sort of explanation on those numbers. These are the cases that we could confirm where a journalist was killed in relation to their reporting. There are unfortunately many risks that journalists face in the field doing their work, and sometimes due to circumstances, it's not always possible to determine immediately if the journalist themselves was directly a target or if it was directly in relation to their work. If we zoom into the Middle East, North Africa region for 1 second, for example, we saw the killing of Luqman Salim in Lebanon last year, which was kind of the only confirmed case of a journalist killed for their work on record in the Middle East, North Africa, which is a very, very notable decline from previous years in the region. However, we were also investigating other cases in the region, such as Rasha Abdullah al-Harazi in Yemen, who was killed in a car bomb in November in Aden. We believe that she was killed. So far, all the reporting indicates that she was killed in a bombing which was targeting her husband, who is also a journalist. But with these sorts of cases, they do illustrate just the risks that journalists continue to face in the region and face worldwide. And I think that, unfortunately, the numbers paint a pretty grim picture of what press freedom is looking like worldwide.
Absolutely. And if we zoom in on the Arab world in particular in 2021, if you can give us a few statistics, numbers, figures about, for example, the number of journalists who were killed, harassed, imprisoned in this region, that would be very helpful, please, Justin.
Sure, absolutely. So in the Middle East, North Africa region, we saw So we saw, first of all, 25 journalists behind bars in Egypt, which made it the third largest jailer of journalists in the world, worldwide. It has been at the top of those rankings for several years, unfortunately. We've seen some fluctuation in the numbers. And with Egypt in particular, we have seen in 2021, we saw a number of journalists who have been held for years being released, but unfortunately, that was displaced by some new arrests that we saw. And then also kind of really high up on the rankings is Saudi Arabia, which has had at least 14 journalists behind bars as of December 1st, 2021. The year before, there were at least 24 behind bars, so that number has gone down. However, that doesn't necessarily signify an improvement in the situation, and I can go more to that in a moment. Also very high up there, we see Iran with at least 11 journalists behind bars in 2021. Bahrain had at least 6. There was reports of one recent release, and then we also saw several journalists continue to be behind bars in Iraq, Syria, and then Morocco, Algeria too. At least 4 imprisoned in Iraq and in Syria, at least 3 imprisoned in Morocco, 2 in Algeria. In terms of journalists who were killed, targeted for their work, as I got into earlier, there was one confirmed case of Luqman Salim in Lebanon, and then also the killing of Rasha Abdullah Hadrazi as well in Yemen. I think it's also important to make a couple of additional points. First of all, this counts journalists who are behind bars who are being imprisoned by kind of internationally recognized state governments representing nation states. So, for example, that number does not include Yemen, where the Ansar Allah group, the Houthis, have been imprisoning a number of journalists. Most notably, there have been 4 journalists behind bars since 2015 who are now facing a death penalty. And we've also been investigating several additional reports of journalists who have been detained in 2021 and the beginning of 2022. This is an example of a non-state actor, technically, which has effectively taken over the capital of Sana'a and also the north and west of the country and the state institutions which are there, and have actually, in fact, weaponized those state institutions against journalists to imprison journalists just like a internationally recognized government would. So that's one caveat. The other one is that even in cases where we don't have any recorded imprisonments of journalists, or we have seen those numbers gone down, the numbers don't take into account the other restrictions that journalists may face. For example, in Egypt, like, we know that there are several journalists who have had to report to the police station several times a week after their release and face the possibility of rearrest at any time. In Saudi Arabia, we see that oftentimes essentially in Saudi Arabia, the space for press freedom is so completely closed that journalists who are released effectively can't work in journalism again or can't share anything on social media. With Iran, we see how there are so many journalists who have fled the country, and we see that they also have a campaign of silencing journalists beyond borders, as well as their harassment of BBC Persian reporters in recent years has shown. And we can also, and I think Ismail can speak more to this, in case such as Sudan, where we see journalists oftentimes arrested who are maybe released after a few days or a few weeks or several hours, but are oftentimes beaten in custody, and this kind of string of arrests that we see in many countries of journalists covering protests can also serve to intimidate and harass them as well.
Thank you, Justin, for this very comprehensive overview of the status of journalism, first in the around the world in 2021, and then in the Arab world and the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa in 2021. I'm afraid it's a very grim picture and a very scary one. So Ismail, having worked as a journalist yourself for many years, I want to ask you the direct question. What are some of the most important contributing factors that create this kind of very scary and unsettling working environment for journalists in this region?
There's a number of issues I think that when discussing press freedom in the region to consider. Definitely the ability of journalists to do their work is high up there. Given what kind of political conditions that these journalists are working in, I think is number one. If you look at a place like Sudan, where you had a military coup last October, that has made it more difficult for journalists to do their work, especially after the Sudanese revolution of 2018, 2019, where we saw some opening to a degree of press freedom space, not completely. This has been a transitional period in Sudan. And you can say the same thing about the situation in other countries, in Tunisia, and in Egypt and elsewhere. It depends on the political situation and the ability for journalists to do their work. That's one thing. The economic situation, especially considering the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic has had on the economies of some of these countries, the ability of news outlets to do their work, depending on their own economic situation. There's one important magazine, Al Hadatha, in Sudan, that just recently shut down, largely because of the economic situation and its inability to continue to stand. And one of the most important progressive and outlets in Sudan in recent years. There are other issues, access to the internet and control of the internet, which is extremely important. I think today, most receivers of news, consumers of news in the Arab world and really worldwide, depend heavily on the internet. The traditional sources of news, whether newspapers, radio, television, I think have taken a second place back behind internet-based reporting from WhatsApp today. Really is in the region has become the main source of news. There are also issues of the manipulation of news, quote unquote fake news, and trying to verify these news that has in itself has become an industry. Recently, we know that Facebook has shut down several Russia-based outlets that were targeting Sudan with quote unquote fake news. That has also become a part of the media ecosystem, not just in Sudan, but really in the region. So given the political situation, given the economic situation, the varying degrees of press freedom, I think that really has played an important role in how consumers of news consume and get their news.
Absolutely. It seems to be a very complex and complicated picture with so many different aspects and dimensions, not just one. We'll come back to this very interesting and important discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
While we've been staying safe at home, scientists have been on a journey. The destination, a COVID-19 vaccine. This journey began decades ago with research into other coronaviruses. Scientists built from there with months of research and development, cooperation with other experts worldwide, and clinical trials on tens of thousands of volunteers of diverse race, age, and health status. They arrived at a safe, effective vaccine, and hundreds of thousands in Michigan have already been vaccinated. But the next step is ours. We need to get the vaccine when we can. Keep wearing masks correctly and taking precautions until we reach our destination, freedom from COVID-19 and getting back to the lives we love. Discover the facts for yourself at michigan.gov/COVID vaccine. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
At Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic in Dearborn, we provide effective physical therapy sessions in order to limit pain and discomfort. Top Rehab provides physical therapy care for any diagnosis prescribed by a physician, and we regularly see and treat conditions such as stroke, TMJ, fibromyalgia, sciatica, joint pain, and more. We use a variety of pain management methods, including modalities, soft tissue mobilization, and therapeutic exercise. If you're in need of physical rehabilitation or physical physical therapy, get the highest quality health care at Top Rehab. Most insurance is accepted and we're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 to 6, Tuesday and Thursday 8 to 5, and Saturday 10 till 2. Call for an appointment today at 313-846-0555. That's 313-846-0555. Choose Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic on Michigan Avenue in Dearborn. Life's too short to be in pain. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab offers a great array of your favorite Mediterranean meals. Meals range from lamb specialties, shawarma sandwiches, and seafood dinners. Plus, they offer big trays of your favorite food and so much more. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab is located at 32839 Northwestern Highway in Farmington Hills and is open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So stop in or call Kashat's today at 248-538-9552. That number again, 248-538-9552. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab will definitely leave you satisfied. When it comes to reproductive medicine, IVF Michigan Fertility Centers are the recognized leaders. With locations in Bloomfield Hills and 5 other cities in Michigan and Ohio, IVF has experts in all aspects of the field. As a founding member of IVF Michigan Fertility Centers, Dr. Nicholas Shama is one of the leading reproductive endocrinologists in Michigan and Ohio. Dr. Shama has performed over 10,000 IVF cases and has helped thousands of couples fulfill their dreams of parenthood. American board certified in both obstetrics and gynecology and reproductive endocrinology and infertility, Dr. Nicholas Shama is a very caring, compassionate, expert physician that understands not only the medical but also the emotional toil of infertility on his patients. When it's time, get personalized care from Dr. Nicholas Shama at IVF Michigan Fertility Centers in Michigan and Ohio. Call toll-free 855-952-9600, 855-952-9600.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about a very important and timely topic: press freedom in the Arab world and the MENA region in 2021, the most important changes and challenges. And with me this morning discussing this important topic are Mr. Justin Shilad from Committee to Protect Journalists and independent Sudanese American journalist Ismail Kushkush. Ismail, before going to the break, Justin said something very important that really caught my attention, which is the fact that they had confirmed cases of maybe disappearing, killed, or imprisoned journalists. But there were also a lot of unconfirmed cases. What could be some of the factors or reasons behind the fact that we can see unconfirmed cases of journalist harassment, imprisonment, or other types of violations against journalists and press freedom in this part of the world? Please, Ismail.
So I think one issue would be really access to places and locations where journalists are either harassed, detained, arrested, and the ability of those journalists to inform about their own conditions. I mean, I'm thinking of one case in Sudan. So we have journalists covering events in Darfur, in the western part of the country, where we saw assaults on journalists, but we only knew about that much later because of access or either control of the internet or communications. And we can be assured that this happens in different parts of the region, where journalists are either detained, assaulted, and don't have the ability to inform, or in some cases may not even be aware of who to contact or to reach what authorities. So that happens quite regularly in different parts of the region.
It's a very scary situation. It adds to the dangers faced by journalists. Justin, building up on this particular point, are there certain mechanisms or techniques that maybe are used by Committee to Protect Journalists and other similar organizations that are very interested in protecting journalists and protecting their own freedom of expression and performing their own role as journalists and reporters to actually intervene or to try to detect or find out or discover these cases of otherwise unconfirmed harassments and imprisonments and jailings?
Sure, absolutely. I think that there's first of all, I think that there's something. So when we talk about specifically at the Committee to Protect Journalists, when you talk about unconfirmed cases, that specifically in relation to our data means that these are cases where we may know of a specific case of someone who was killed or imprisoned, but we are working to confirm that it was in connection to their reporting. I think that feeds into a broader point, which I want to come back to in a moment. But that's kind of how we use that. But then there is also the issue, which you asked about, which Ismail brought up as well, of actually trying to confirm or get basic information about what is happening. And Darfur, I think, is one example of that. And this has been an ongoing, pervasive problem throughout the region that we see, where, for example, much of my focus in terms of research over the past few years has been in Saudi Arabia, in terms of trying to just research which journalists are imprisoned there. Just even this very basic information, attaining this can be very, very challenging. It's a situation where it is very risky to reach out to anyone directly in the country due to the overwhelming surveillance and kind of use of spyware against the general population, and also the possibility for retaliation from authorities to speaking to international outlets. So this is something that we have definitely come upon as a challenge in Saudi and throughout the region. And I know that that's also, I have spoken to counterparts at many other organizations who have dealt with similar issues as well. So I think that that's something that we're always trying to research, whether it's work with partner organizations which are based within the region or have a more specific regional focus, who have contacts who can communicate with them in a secure manner. That's how we get this information with journalists we've been in touch with, and also kind of by following news outlets on the ground is how we kind of research and confirm these cases. And I think that there's one more kind of thing that I want to say as well, which is that there is, going off of what Ismail said earlier, in terms of confirming the cases, you also have this, but just also talking in terms of trying to confirm the cases, there is this, people are, even when confirmed that someone has been arrested or targeted for their work, there's oftentimes this confluence of factors which can influence that as well. And so that's something where it could be due to something that they're reporting at the moment. It could be retaliation for something that they've reported on in the past, or it could be because they're seen as activists. That's something that as CPJ, we spend a lot of time trying to determine if someone is a protester or an activist, or if they're actually doing works of journalism. In the region, we see those lines can oftentimes become very blurred. And then that becomes even more complex to parse out when the authorities themselves really make no distinction as to journalists doing their work or their political opponents. Many authorities in many parts of the world and in the region have said outright that anyone participating in journalism which is not state sanctioned is essentially engaging in opposition political activity. So that kind of gives you a sense of some of the challenges. Absolutely.
And that makes the situation even much more complex and much more complicated, because there are some cases where this line becomes very blurry, right? And some journalists cross this line, so they actually become journalists/activists, which of course puts them very much under the government's surveillance and under the government's eye as possible or potential opponents of the regime, and therefore increases the risk of their own dangers and in terms of imprisonment, harassment, or even killing in some cases. Ismail, I want to turn to a very important point, which is digital media in the Arab world. It is no secret that at the beginning of the uprisings in 2011, there was a lot of euphoria. We even refer to it in academia as techno-euphoria. Digital media is great. It is going to be a great space for press freedom and freedom of expression. Fast forward 11 years later, we're now in 2022. This is not the situation. In fact, we have cybercrime laws that pretty much endanger and curb freedom of expression in the Arab world. Can you please comment briefly on this kind of transition in the role of digital media and social media in the Arab world, from tools of liberation to tools of repression in some cases?
Yeah, that's a very key component. I think really this particular topic is really the major issue right now with press freedom. I think because it's still in a very vague gray area in terms of laws, in terms of what can you. I mean, we see journalists being arrested, harassed for Facebook posts, in Sudan and elsewhere. As you mentioned, in 2011, with the height of the Arab Spring, digital media became a component of a liberating component in the region. Today, I think governments are quite conscious of the importance of digital media, and we see new laws in different countries, in the Gulf, and Egypt, and Sudan, that restrict or vague laws, quite frankly, on what constitutes political activism and what constitutes journalism. And we're seeing journalists being arrested again, for tweets or for Facebook posts. This I think is an area that we're still in the midst of trying to figure out. What is activism, what is and what is legal, and what is what isn't. And this, in addition to the space of on the main social media platforms, we have to put in consideration also things like spyware and surveillance and the kind of technology that's being used to spy on either activists or journalists. The issue of, again, fake news or fake accounts and how that plays a role in creating a particular the promotion of certain narratives or understandings of news, of politics. All of that, I think, has just become a very big component and has complicated really this issue of press freedom in the region.
Absolutely, and we're seeing this shifting role, as I said, of digital media and social media turning from tools of liberation to tools of repression, which means we're now talking about not techno-euphoria, but we're talking about digital authoritarianism and how these tools are being used by regimes in the Arab region to really crack down on opponents and to curb freedom of expression in the Arab world. We'll come back to this very interesting and important discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
What's my ETA?
Your estimated time of arrival is 9:17.
I'm late. I'll have to punch it.
Speeding will save you just 1 minute and 36 seconds. It will also increase your risk of a crash, as well as the odds that you will be stopped and issued an expensive speeding ticket.
Yeah, but...
In 1 year, there were 22,000 speeding-related crashes in Michigan, resulting in 200 deaths.
If I had someone in the car with me, I'd drive slower. But it's just me.
This is not a logical response. Though you have no passenger, surrounding cars contain 27 others, including 5 children and 1 Labrador Retriever.
How do you know all this stuff?
I know everything, Kevin.
Your risk of a crash increases with every mile you drive over the speed limit. So slow down. Speed enforcement is happening now. A message from the Michigan Office of Highway Safety Planning.
Are your hands feeling numb? Do you feel pain opening up a jar, turning a key? Are you noticing that your elbow and your shoulder are becoming stiff? Or were you recently injured in your arm? Hello, I'm Dr. Al-Majid Katranji, and at the Katranji Hand Center, which just recently opened down the street from the Somerset Mall, we can provide you with the latest in hand, wrist, elbow, and shoulder care. Visit us at www.katranjihandcenter.com to learn the latest techniques that we have to offer you, and I look forward to taking care of you.
Visit us in Troy at 1565 West Big Beaver Road, Building F, or call Katranji Hand Center for an appointment at 248-869-4263. That's 248-869-4263. Enjoy the first Syrian-style cuisine in Michigan. At Damas Cuisine and Catering, you'll find a wide selection of Syrian foods and sweets in our menu, like frikeh, hoisin, grape leaves with steak, mishawi platter, hot mahashi, char-grilled kebab, shawarma, and much more. Get super fast delivery from Damas Cuisine and Catering right to your door. Order online at damascuisine.com/menu and track your order live. Damas Cuisine and Catering, 28841 Orchard Lake Road in Farmington Hills. Call 248-987-4985.
When you're looking for the best in optical care, Dr. Imad Nakash is your doctor to see. With years of experience and thousands of successful procedures performed, you can trust your eyes to Dr. Imad Nakash. See Dr. Imad Nakash and his professional staff for your eye care needs. There's 2 locations to serve you. In Hazel Park, call 248-336-3937. 248-336-3937. In Rochester Hills, call 248-299-3937. That's 248-299-3937.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about a very important and timely topic, press freedom in the Arab world and the MENA region in 2021, the most important changes and challenges. And with me this morning discussing this important and timely topic are Mr. Justin Shalad from Committee to Protect Journalists and Mr. Ismail Kushkush, an independent Sudanese American journalist. Ismail, a lot of important developments took place in Sudan in 2021. It is no secret that we have seen this coup and takeover by the military, and that had a lot of dire consequences on the margin of freedom of the press in Sudan and what the Sudanese journalists actually encountered and faced in 2021. Can you please shed some light on this very important development?
Right. So October 2021, we saw the military dissolve the Sovereignty Council, which was leading the country during this transitional period from the fall of the government of Omar al-Bashir in 2019 to supposedly elections in 2023. One of the first decisions was to dissolve or dismiss all those the ministries, including the Ministry of Information, which was responsible for media and journalism in Sudan. So we saw the dismissal of the Minister of Information, Hashim Hasab al-Rasul, who was the civilian Minister of Information. We saw the dismissal of members of the Sudan Television and Radio Broadcasting Company, and the bringing back of personnel from the Bashir government to take place, including the head of the TV, Sudan TV, Mr. Luqman Ahmed, who is a former BBC Arabic bureau chief in Washington. We see this bringing back of the old guard into the places of, so that of course has influenced the narrative of what is being reported on the ground in Sudan. The other thing is for journalists who have been trying to cover the protests that have taken place since October up to today, that we see the harassment, the arrest, the assault of a number of journalists, the detaining of journalists, even for a few hours. I think for me, one of the interesting things is to see that this is not this is a different type of authoritarianism. It's not a complete out assault and banning of journalism. There's a degree, some degree of ability for journalists to do their work. But I think as authoritarian rulers become conscious of the significance of public opinion and global public opinion, you will see some degree, but not completely banning. So that's, I think, what is happening in Sudan at the moment. But we did see the closure of one important newspaper, Demokrati, and the detaining of its editor in chief, Haj Barraq, who was in hiding for a couple of months. The other thing I think, and again, this is tied to the question of press freedom, is we know that Pan-Arab satellite TV has become a major source of information, and instead of banning access to, what we see is these selection of particular quote-unquote experts to be the commentators on different satellite TV shows. So you see these comparing narratives, and the significance is that on different shows you have different people who, some of us journalists who are not aware of who these quote-unquote experts are, who are tied to certain political circles, often to the military or so. And instead of banning access, you see this insertion of narratives that are backed by the authoritarian government, and that's clearly happening in Sudan, and it's been happening in the region. You see it in Tunisia, you see it in Egypt, and elsewhere.
Absolutely. It's a very, I'm afraid, grim and bleak picture for practicing journalism in this part of the world. There is no question about it. And we do hope and pray that things take a better turn, not just in Sudan, but also in other parts of the Arab world when it comes to political freedom in general and press freedom in particular. Justin, back to you. And I have a question about the legal aspects. We talked about cybercrime laws and some of the dangers that are existing, unfortunately, in the digital realm. But what about other punitive measures, other legal measures and tools that are used by repressive and authoritarian regimes in the Arab world and the MENA region at large to curb freedom of expression and to prevent journalists from doing their work in exposing the truth?
I think that we see a number of different laws that are used to target journalists in the region, and I think that the legal threats are manifold. I think that the contradiction is also that we see this sort of vast array of laws and legislation that can be weaponized against journalists. And at the same time, we also see that there's such vague wording in these laws, which Ismail talked about earlier, and also just a general lack of rule of law and accountability on the official part, that this kind of legal vacuum can also pose a challenge to journalists as well. I can explain. So we talked earlier about cybercrimes laws, about these vaguely worded laws that prescribe prison terms for kind of using social media or undermining the stability of the country or disturbing social fabric. We see that wording in many different countries, in UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi, and the wording is so vague that pretty much anything that you post on social media can contribute to disturbing the social fabric. We also see this with the so-called false news laws. Egypt has, for several years now, been by far the top jailer journalist in the world, specifically on these charges of spreading false news. There is a certain irony here, which is that, which also we were talking about earlier, which Ismail mentioned, which is that you have seen authoritarian governments in the region, in fact, worldwide, at the same time, using their state-sanctioned media outlets, using their kind of own personnel to spread their own narrative, oftentimes using facts which are not true. And so you have something where these state governments, these state authorities are in a sense spreading false news and also imprisoning journalists who counter that narrative by accusing them of spreading false news. I mean, there is no small level of irony here. And I think that what makes this such a nefarious development is that with many countries, with many governments in the region, such as Egypt, started out doing this in 2013 after the coup, and then with the insurgency in the Sinai, is that they specifically state that journalists should only follow what our Ministry of Defense says in terms of the events that are going on. And then anybody who contradicts that or questions that then is liable for spreading false news. I think that this is something, so these are sort of the specific laws that we see come to play, which are being used to target journalists. But I think when we were talking before about the vague nature of them and how, then I think that also points to something else too, which is that, A, the laws are very broad, and so they could be interpreted any which way to target journalists. But then B, what we've also seen too is journalists were detained sometimes for months, sometimes for years on end, without charge, without trial. We saw that in Egypt, we saw that in Saudi Arabia, we saw that with the use of administrative detention in Israel, like detaining Palestinian journalists. This thing of there are no charges against people, and sometimes, in some cases, we see governments passing laws on the books after they've already been holding journalists for months or years on specific charges, such as spreading false news. So I think this points to the other issue, which is that there is no rule of law and accountability on the part of the authorities. So on the one hand, they can pass these restrictive new laws. At the same time, they can also effectively detain journalists for whatever reason they see fit and then make up the laws after that. And so there's not even any actual cause that they have to use to justify to detain the journalists. It's a very contradictory situation where you have repressive laws and then absence of rule of law, all of which combine to make a very hazardous legal environment for journalists.
Absolutely, there's no question about it. And I think that the vagueness and ambiguity and broadness of these laws is pretty much done on purpose. They're purposefully left very broad and very ambiguous and very vague to give the regimes much more room to interpret them the way they wish, and therefore to crack down even more on their own opponents, including journalists who dare to speak truth to power. So Ismail, back to you with a question about Tunisia. Tunisia is another Arab country that witnessed also some unfortunate changes and shifts in terms of political freedom in general and press freedom in particular in 2021. Would you like to comment on this as well, please?
I think, again, it's the ability to cover the news, and we, in Tunisia we saw the suspending of Al Jazeera's coverage of events, as of where this becomes politicized, in essence. So the home base of a news outlet that, or the coverage of a news outlet that is perceived to be hostile comes under attack and becomes an excuse for authorities to withdraw the license or suspend the coverage of a news outlet. We saw this in Tunisia. We saw this in Sudan 10 days ago with Al Jazeera Mubashir, where authorities suspended the license of Al Jazeera Mubashir for quote unquote broadcasting information that was contrary to Sudanese values, whatever that means. This has become, as Justin mentioned, that the vagueness of all of this, of how authorities can interpret certain laws and use that to suspend, to freeze the work of journalists. We saw that with Al Jazeera in Tunisia. And with other places, this I think as I mentioned earlier, authorities have become more savvy in how they deal with this. It's not a closure or a permanent arrest of journalists, but they've become more savvy because they've become aware that global opinion does play a role and has consequences.
Absolutely. These are very important things that we have to bear in mind. And it seems like many of these challenges, unfortunately, are going to be ongoing for some time for journalists in the Arab world and the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa at large, for some time to come, unfortunately. We'll come back to this very interesting and important discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Life is a nonprofit charity that's provided humanitarian aid and development to people and communities for over 25 years, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Please help improve these efforts. Make your tax-deductible donation to Life now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Donna, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
Are you going to start a restaurant or a grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
Get ready for an amazing experience at Ishtar Restaurant on 15 Mile Road in Sterling Heights. Enjoy excellent hospitality from owners Ali Al-Baghdadi and Fatty Bonham, serving the best in Mediterranean food. Try Chef Ali Al-Baghdadi's famous shawarma, the best Iraqi grills and food, and the best Arabic and international dishes. Dine in our authentic atmosphere or take out. Call 586-698-2585 or check us out on Facebook. Ishtar Restaurant practices all CDC guidelines and is open every day 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Have an amazing experience today at Ishtar Restaurant, 3625 15 Mile Road, Sterling Heights.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about a very important topic, which is press freedom in the Arab world and the MENA region at large in 2021, the most important changes and challenges. And with me this morning discussing this topic is Mr. Justin Shilad from Committee to Protect Journalists and Sudanese-American journalist Ismail Kushkush. Ismail, you mentioned before COVID-19, and you said that COVID-19 did have some impacts on Arab journalists and journalism in this part of the world. I would like you to elaborate a little bit on how that impacted journalists doing their job in this part of the world in 2021, please.
I think there's more than one angle to this. One, I mean, certainly is how the economies have been affected. I mean, economies worldwide have been affected by the pandemic, and for media outlets that are independent, semi-independent, their revenues have certainly been affected by the pandemic and their ability to either pay their journalists, etc. And where journalists have had to either work at home, like all of us worldwide, and had their salaries reduced, some have had to quit their jobs, and again, this is happening everywhere. So it's one aspect. And then the question of what quote unquote fake news, whether related to the pandemic or how that can be used politically. And this whole idea that the pandemic, you see these narratives in the region that the pandemic and the policies as a consequence of the pandemic as some sort of conspiracy theory, and those are being used to restrict certain freedoms and reporting on the pandemic. Or any criticism of authorities' responses to the pandemic by journalists in the region also becomes an excuse to limit the freedom of journalists. We saw that. I saw it early in Sudan when famously the Minister of Health at the time was very brutally honest about how the response should be about staying home and how that affected the journalism in Sudan. So I mean, there's more than one angle. And this is happening globally, not just in the Arab world, but the impact of the pandemic on journalism and the ability to report.
Of course, because the pandemic had all of these political, economic, and social, consequences, it does have a huge impact on, journalism. And I'm saying it does, not it did, because unfortunately it's still an ongoing threat for many people all over the world, including for journalists doing their work. You see the political, of course, opportunism of the regimes. The regimes try to take advantage of the pandemic in terms of curbing freedom of the press and freedom of expression even more, using cybercrime laws, as we mentioned before, the very vague definition of these terms, and even terms like disinformation, misinformation, have been exploited by regimes in this region to crack down on opponents and to crack down on journalists doing their work, not to mention the shutting down, of course, of the media organizations. And unfortunately, women journalists had the worst end of the stick when it comes to that. In many cases, we say they are the hardest to hire and they are the easiest to fire. So many women journalists also suffered from the consequences of the pandemic in terms of shutdowns and losing their own jobs. Justin, back to you with a question about the role of the Committee to Protect Journalists in terms of putting some protections in place for journalists in the Arab world and the Middle East and North Africa at large who are trying to do their job. What are some of these measures, please?
So there's a few different things. One of the things that we do is that on our website, www.cpj.org, you can find that we have links to a number of safety resources for journalists who are covering all sorts of different topics. We have safety advisories, alerts, and different resources for ranging from kind of covering civil disturbances, unrest, protests, natural disasters, all the above. We also had a guide which had been updated for covering news safely during the time of COVID-19. And we also have guides on cybersecurity and safety with the proliferation of surveillance technology. At CPJ, we also we work in coordination in conjunction with a number of different organizations who can provide assistance to journalists in some situations, including legal help, help with medical expenses. In some very limited circumstances, we can provide direct assistance. And we've also, in very exceptional circumstances, been a part of efforts to evacuate journalists from war zones, from very dangerous situations, as happened with Syria in 2018 and Afghanistan last year with the takeover of the Taliban. Those are some of the things that we do. And then a big core of our work as well is just the documenting and advocacy, is just shining light on press freedom violations, on restrictive legislation, on trends that we see worldwide, and holding governments and authorities worldwide to account for those.
Yeah, but let me tell you very frankly, a lot of people feel like, these are very important roles, but it is very necessary, but maybe not sufficient. Like even when we look at the broader picture, beyond Committee to Protect Journalists, there's Freedom House. There are also organizations that care for human rights worldwide, like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and all of them have raised the alarm, right, about the deteriorating condition of freedom of expression at large and press freedom in the Arab world and the Middle East and North Africa. Still, I believe that there's this feeling like there's a lot more that needs to be done. There is also the need for international accountability. We haven't seen, for example, serious consequences for the brutal and horrific murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. And there are many other horrific cases, some of which we heard about and some of which we did not hear about, unfortunately. So can you speak a little bit about this whole situation of the role of the international community, the role of human rights organizations, the lack of international accountability? Can you please explore and try to shed light on some of that, please?
Absolutely. And I think that that is the big piece, and that's the big missing piece right now, that you very rightly mentioned the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the lack of justice years and years after that, and this continuing impunity. This is something that we see throughout the region, throughout the world. And I can give one example of this, which is that we have seen, I spoke about Yemen, about the 4 journalists who are facing the death penalty there. When we talk about internet outages, internet shutdowns, there was the entire country, almost the entire country, being cut off from internet access for nearly 4 days after Saudi-led coalition strike in Hodeidah last week. And one thing that's really important to point out with regards to Yemen is that there had been for years, since 2017, I believe, an independent international mechanism, the group of feminine experts set up by the UN Human Rights Council to investigate war crimes, human rights abuses committed by all sides. What we saw last year was that the Human Rights Council declined to renew that body's mandate after what some reports said was an intense lobbying campaign on the part of the Saudi and Emirati governments. I think that this shows 2 things. This shows that, first of all, the importance of having some sort of accountability mechanism, some sort of international independent level mechanism to not only spotlight these abuses of journalists, but to coordinate the international community to take action to hold perpetrators to account. And I think, secondly, it also unfortunately underscores the lack of will and resolve on the part of the international community, on the part of many international actors as well. And I think that we see that in many other circumstances too. And we see that with, for example, the US once again kind of resuming and even upping its sales of arms to Egypt, to the Egyptian government, to the Saudi government, despite the overwhelming number of journalists in prison in Egypt, despite the lack of accountability for Jamal Khashoggi's murder. I think that that's something where the United States government needs to reassess and reconsider where it places press freedom in the international sphere. And it's something that the international community at large needs to think about and consider too, with regards to not only press freedom, but human rights generally and civil space generally too. And I think that that's something that we need to see, for example, if we talk about negotiations in Sudan, for example, that, how can you negotiate press freedom or basic human rights if we're talking about the current military government there after the coup? Same thing in Yemen. How can you put imprisoned journalists who've been detained for more than 6 years on the threat of death penalty as something to be negotiated out over the table? You just can't. I think that we need independent international level accountability, and we need a resolve from the international community to make it very clear that press freedom and basic human rights are not up for negotiation.
Absolutely, I cannot agree more. It cannot be done by one party alone. We need this kind of solidarity, coordination, and cooperation between international and regional players in order to try to ensure better protection for journalists who are doing their job in this volatile part of the world. And speaking of that, Ismail, I'm going to end with you. We just have a couple of minutes left in the program. Unfortunately, the good times always fly very quickly. We have 1 minute actually. So very quickly, in maybe less than 1 minute, what do you want to see in terms of protection for journalists as a journalist doing your job in this part of the world, in the Arab region? Very briefly, in less than 1 minute, what do you want to see in place to protect you as a journalist doing your work?
I think, one key thing is to understand, again, as I mentioned earlier, the internet and online outlets have really become the main source of information. Access to the internet and protection of information that is disseminated through the internet, I think is a key issue. This is still a gray area, the internet, information, and democracy. But I think this is something that we should all be conscious of. And some of the same discussions that are happening here in the United States on the role of big tech companies and their role in democracy is starting to happen in the Arab world and in the Middle East and other parts of the world. What roles do companies like Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp have in being a part of or the democratic process? I think all of that is something that we should all be conscious of and play a role ensuring that in order to have democratic systems in these countries that allow for journalists to do their work, access to information is a human right. It should be seen as a human right.
Yes.
And for journalists to do their work benefits our societies in the region.
Absolutely. We all need freedom of information and freedom of the press. It's very important to us. And with that, I would like to thank my guests, Mr. Justin Filadze and Mr. Ismail Kushkush, and to thank all our listeners and viewers everywhere. Thank you so much. Take care and goodbye.